Welcome all, and thank you for listening this podcast. This is Coding Talks podcast with myself Vishnu Viji. Just a quick and brief introduction about myself. I am in the IT field for past 15 years, working as a .NET developer, building enterprise level applications, and I have also worked with the different cloud technologies like Microsoft Azure, Amazon AWS, and GCP. This is an audio podcast where I share my opinion and views on different technologies that I have connected with. All the opinions that I share are purely personal and do not represent any of the employer's view in any way. I also own an YouTube channel which is Coding Talks with Vishnu Viji. Feel free to check out the YouTube channel as well. Recognizing my contributions last year, Amazon awarded me the title Community Builder for Storage. I have added different sessions in my YouTube channel, so if you have interest, please feel free to check out that. I also own a meetup group which is called the Cloud Computing, Coding Talks Cloud Computing, which is available on Meetup. Occasionally, I hold different sessions that are related to cloud technologies in that meetup group. All the different sessions that I had, all the past sessions that I had, and its recordings are available from my YouTube channel. Also, this podcast is available on all audio platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google, and much more. So feel free to listen from any of your favorite podcast as you like. In this today's episode, which is the recording date is 9th of April 2022, I will like to talk about the Blazor .NET technology. To those of you who are new, Blazor is a framework which can be used to develop single-page web applications, or what we usually call as SPA architecture using .NET technologies. Developers who are comfortable working with C# or if they have an understanding about some understanding about the C#, they can easily develop single page applications using Blazor without depending on the so-called popular client-side language called JavaScript or any of its associated framework. Naturally, when we want to develop some client-side application, we either go for JavaScript in the olden days, and when it got advanced, some technologies, some libraries like the jQuery came into existence, and today different companies have already started out different the JavaScript framework and libraries like Angular and React, and many are using those frameworks or libraries to create single-paged web applications. So what about if you have a liking for the C# and if you want to develop a single-page application purely using C# and also at the same time you want to leverage some of the client-side capabilities as well. So Blazor is for that purpose, and that is what we are going to discuss in today's episode. So before I move much into Blazor, before I dive into Blazor, we can understand a bit about JavaScript in general. So like I said, traditionally for developing web application and especially applications that are running inside the browser, or we can call particularly the single page applications or SPA, JavaScript was considered as a familiar choice for most of the developers. The main reason that I feel for this is JavaScript works at the user side, that is inside the browser, which can offer a much more interactive client-side experience. Naturally, the round trip between the client side and the server can be reduced when using a JavaScript and its advanced technologies that evolved like the Ajax. So furthermore, with the introduction of technologies, new popular frameworks and libraries came into existence, like the one is the one is the React.js from Facebook, and another one is Angular from Google. All these led to a new style of web development where the developer begins to think developing web applications by assembling pieces of web page. So just like a building is constructed using different blocks, we can think about creating a web page by assembling the different functionalities of a web page piece by piece. So it's called the components. So instead of thinking to develop a web page as a single piece, with the help of these framework and libraries, developers can divide or construct more modular functionalities, and then they can assemble. In the web terminology, we call that as composing the components, and we can assemble that into a web page. So these modular pieces of specialized functionality are what we call nowadays in terms of components. So imagine a page in a website or a section in a website called a login page. You can think about the login page and you can think that, okay, it can be constructed using some of the smaller components like login button, maybe a typical login user box, login password box, then maybe a checkbox for remembering the password. Then it can be a reset box. Also, along with that, we can have a reset email box and reset button as well. So all these are individual components which can be created, and then the developer can focus on a single modular part while developing the web application. So if he is developing a web application, he can focus on that login part or that reset part. If he want to further enhance the login button a bit more, he can create a component for that button and can focus on enhancing that button, and that button can be reused later in different part of the applications. So that is called a component. So when we think about components in modern web applications, a component can be considered as an individual piece which includes all the different elements that are responsible for displaying and functioning the component. If you take an example of the reset password component, the reset password component can have different elements, like it may need the label elements, that is the HTML elements, then some form of alert or something which if we want to display, it may need a JavaScript element. And similarly, if a component needs some data to display or some data to save to the database, it needs an API for that purpose as well. So all these different elements can be encompassed into a single piece of modular functionality where we called that as components. And by identifying a web page as a composition of different components, developer can focus on a particular area, and also it makes the development much more modular. So we not yet entered into Blazor. Before introducing to Blazor, I would like to think about all these different things related to modern web development, like the component way of development. So traditionally we used to develop a web page as a single web page, next web page or something like that. But modern days, for the purpose of reusability and for maintaining web application, a component structured way of development is what preferred. So that same approach is what almost all the different frameworks like the React, Angular and all that is following nowadays. So if you ask a React developer or an Angular developer, they might already familiar with the term component. So that same component architecture is what used here in Blazor as well. So understanding a bit about component is essential or critical in developing modern web application. So the reason I am explaining the reason why we are going for a component based architecture. The main reason is that a particular portion or the particular portion of the web page can be make more modular, and we can make the code more maintainable. Once I talked with a React developer, and we were discussing about a component which offers a functionality for displaying a list of data. So he mentioned to me that we can split the component into much more modular component, like we can take away that list into a list component, and inside a list there will be each item which can be another distinct component. In this way we can break the component into further down, and the more we break down, the much better experience that these libraries and frameworks can offer. So when we break down a page into much modular component, the advantage is like we can focus on that particular area, especially if there is a change or something, we can focus on that area. And second thing is we can reuse that particular area. And from the perspective of that library or for the framework, this breakdown of components into modular components make it much easier for those libraries to display or render that particular portion without re-rendering the full page at all. That is another concept that evolved during the web development from JavaScript time to the modern frameworks era. So when jQuery came into existence, and with the evolvement of Ajax, developers learned to update a particular portion of web page without bothering much about the other part of the application. Traditionally we used to re-render the full page, but that is no longer required. We can update a portion of web page without bothering much about the reloading of the page, and that makes the page a bit more faster and more interactive, and it reduces the round trip between the server. So these are all the approaches which are very much used in modern day web development, and that is the reason why component form of development is common nowadays, whether it be React or Angular or whatever other frameworks of similar nature exist. So that is the thing we can see among. So developing the application as mentioned in this component way is what makes these libraries like React, Angular more popular among web developers. But everything in React or Angular is purely in JavaScript. This means that if a .NET developer like myself, who is familiar with C# and Visual Studio tooling, can't take much advantage of C# features and reuse what I have learned in relation to C# and Visual Studio tooling when it comes to learning a different language like JavaScript for developing web applications. So I remember once I talked with one of my friend who is a JavaScript fan, and it's a few years back, and he was citing that only JavaScript he was mentioning that only JavaScript as a language can make interactive applications, and even though we can use C# or some other language on the back end or something, but still for a rich user experience we need JavaScript. So he was mentioning JavaScript as one of the best language he has ever associated with. So that is true to some extent. And that is the reason why this React and Angular were getting massively popular despite its learning curve. From the perspective of other language developers, whether it be a .NET developer or a Python developer, learning JavaScript is a bit learning curve. There is a bit learning curve involved in learning the JavaScript. To some extent, it's better to learn because companies like Facebook and others, Angular, where Google massively dealing a lot of investment in developing the libraries like React and Angular. But if we think about from the .NET perspective, if we think about whether can we do that same thing in C#, it will be a different kind of experience. So that is what this Blazor is all about. And another one reason why I'm not against JavaScript, but as a .NET developer, I prefer to use the C# for server side and client side. But JavaScript has its own frameworks like the React frameworks and libraries like Angular and React. So definitely these are all matured libraries and frameworks. So definitely we should use them. But personally, having an attachment to C#, like myself, many of the developers would prefer to use C# for developing server side as well as client side applications. So that is why Microsoft sees a great possibility in bringing this Blazor on the front end, so that to some extent C# developers who are proficient with the C# can use this Blazor instead of learning a different language like JavaScript or using that JavaScript at all, because switching is happening when we use two different languages like C# and JavaScript. So if there is a way to develop application strongly focusing on language at a time, so that is what Microsoft is thinking, and in that direction they are investing hugely in Blazor. So it's Blazor is not a new framework. It already there in the .NET ecosystem for past few years. I don't exactly remember. I think back in a few years back, on guy was showing a demo, and he demoed an application written in C#. That is a to-do list application which is running entirely inside a web browser. So this was the trigger for Blazor, and then Blazor evolved, and now if you look at Blazor, it has evolved into a much more mature kind of framework with the different flavors. So this is 2022, and as of recording this episode, if you look at Visual Studio latest version, which is 2022, you can see that you can create a Blazor application with two different flavors, or we can call that as two different hosting models. One is the Blazor WebAssembly, and the second one is the Blazor server. So when I say Blazor to many of my friends, they usually call it's WebAssembly, but there is a different version, different hosting model for Blazor in addition to WebAssembly. That is, Blazor can be purely used as a Blazor server model as well. We will look a bit more detail into what's the difference between these two hosting models, a bit more detail as we go along this episode. So now, as of recording this date, maybe you are listening this at a later point of time, but as of recording this date, Blazor has two different hosting models. That is the Blazor WebAssembly and the Blazor server. In this episode, we will be looking more into these two hosting models. Keep in mind that Blazor is always evolving, so there will be much more versions, much more flavors that may be coming in the future releases, and Microsoft is planning to release on progressive web application based Blazor as well, where you can use Blazor to develop web applications, and it can be run as a progressive web application inside mobile devices as well. So there is a scope for evolvement. So if you are listening this episode at a later point of time, maybe some extra versions will be available at that point of time. Now we can look into what all different flavors. We can look into the two different flavors, two common different flavors that are available as of this recording. So what you can do is, if you are a developer or if you have access to Visual Studio, you can download and install that. So Visual Studio has different versions. Many of you already know about it. For those who are new to Visual Studio, I am explaining this. Visual Studio is the best development experience editor that a .NET developer would ever prefer. And the second editor they prefer is the Visual Studio Code. To learn Blazor, it would be helpful if you can download the Visual Studio latest version from Microsoft official website. For learning and training purpose, you can download the community version, and for enterprise there are different other versions available. You need to download the community version of Visual Studio, and then once you install, you can install that ASP.NET web development web development components while installing the web application, ASP.NET Core web development components while installing the Visual Studio. So once you install that, then open Visual Studio. Now we can see what all different types of Blazor applications we can develop using the Visual Studio. So open Visual Studio. First we can focus on creating a Blazor server project. Like I said, there are two different hosting models of Blazor that are available. We can develop the same application, exactly same looking and exactly same functioning application in two of these hosting models. There is a difference in the way by which it is working that I will explain as we go along. So let's open Visual Studio and create a new project. So you can type on the templates. When we click on create a new project, there is a form open, and then we can select. We can filter the Blazor project templates by typing Blazor on top of that filter box, and then usually Visual Studio will display two options. This is again, I am telling, this is as of recording this episode. Maybe at a later point of time it may change, but as of recording this, it shows two different type of templates. One is the Blazor server project, and another one is the Blazor web assembly. So when many of the articles and many of the blogs talk about Blazor, they usually refer to the web assembly. But there is another thing, as I explained, there is a server component, server hosting model also for Blazor. So you can click on the Blazor server template and fill out all the details like the project name and all, where you want to store the project and all in your local system, and then click on creating. It will take some time, and then you can run the application and you can see a Blazor app running inside the browser. So this is the Blazor server based project which you have created. So the difference here is the page which you can see that is now running inside the browser. The majority of the web page construction is happening on the server, and the Blazor server model of hosting uses a signaler mechanism to communicate between the server and the client side. So just like Ajax, whenever a change is required on the client side, that is inside the browser, we like a click or something, the client side Blazor components, that is also automatically deployed as part of the Blazor templates. So that part is responsible for communicating whatever events that are happening on the client side, and then it will communicate that via SignalR. So SignalR is a communication mechanism that is already in place. So it uses a kind of underlying protocols to communicate between the web server and the client. So depending upon the capability of the browser, it uses the excellent protocol for transferring data between the client side and the server side. So in this case, when we created a Blazor server project, when the user interacts with the web page on the client side, an event associated event or something will be communicated back to the server, and in the server side, that is on the behind scene server side, Blazor fully construct that page. So the full web page construction is happening on the server, and then it sends that updated portion where we want to update. Only that portion is sent back to the Blazor client side using the SignalR mechanism, and that way the client side will automatically update that particular portion, and that is how you see the front end changes. If you created a project in Visual Studio using the Blazor server project as I explained before, you can see a web page, and that, or if you look on that web page left hand side, you can see there is a static. There will be 3 sections. So the first section is a static section. Second section, like the counter and the fetch data sections, are both dynamic sections. So that sections Microsoft has included as part of the template is to show you that these are the possibilities that you can do with Blazor. You can show a static content as well as a dynamic content that is generated from the server. So if you click on the counter section there, on its right hand side, you can see there is a button to increment and decrement the counter. So you can click on increment and decrement the counter, and you can see that the counter is increasing. So when you click on there, the client side Blazor receives that input, and then it is passing back behind the scene to the server side using the SignalR mechanism, and the server constructs that portion which requires the change, and then it sends back to the client side. So the full construction of a page or the DOM construction is happening on the server side. Similarly, you can click on that web page left menu, fetch data, where you can see it loads some data. I think some weather forecast or something, which is also loading from the client side. Which is also loading from the server side. We can inspect a further more to understand what is happening. Now you can, if you are using Chrome or whatever browser like Mozilla or Edge or whatever, open the debugging tool, and inside the debugging tool, open the network tab, and then click again the fetch counter or the counter increment or decrement button. Naturally, you would expect like some kind of API call which is happening behind the scene, but there won't be any API call or anything, because it is not using any API at all. It's using a kind of a mechanism called SignalR to communicate the data between the backend and the front end. So that way, you can easily develop an application with a server, and many of the internal applications that is running inside your a reliable connection environment where you can expect a steady internet connection is there, then this form of development is much faster, because by creating a Blazor server project, many of the things will be handled automatically, like the authorization and many things, like if you want to communicate from the backend to the services or database, that also can be handled very quite easy, because you are in the server and you can directly communicate. So if you think about a React or Angular application, naturally you create components in JavaScript, and then you call an API from the client side, and you require an API on the backend, and then that API would serve the data, and then you will write associate codes to display the data on the front end. So a lot of things you need to do. But in this case of the Blazor server based project template, naturally you can define the components. You will do the same like what you do in the React kind of application, but here it is much simpler. So you can use the C# language purely, no JavaScript is required at all. You can use the C# to develop the modular components, same as like you develop in React or Angular, and then you can assemble that to form a page, and the rest of the things will be handled automatically by the Blazor. So irrespective of the hosting model, like the Blazor server or WebAssembly, you can create the components, and that is another advantage of using the Blazor. Means you can focus on creating the component, and you can use that component irrespective of Blazor server or Blazor client, Blazor WebAssembly model. However, the working differs, and the way by which it works in some environment also differ. We will look a bit more deep into those things as we go along. But mainly you can focus more on C#, the and the Visual Studio tooling. So many of you who already developed with the C# may be familiar with the rich interactive experience that Visual Studio offers. So that things all can be utilized for developing components purely in C#, and then you need to learn some of the concepts like how to create a component in Blazor, which is usually called a razor component, and also some of the different life cycle events like similar to React. There are different lifecycle events also exist here. Modern React uses a kind of a functional kind of approach, but older class-based React components, if you are familiar, you usually use some kind of a lifecycle events, and that same concept is what used here. So there are a few lifecycle events out there. We will look a bit more detail into that as we go along. Not too much into that, but just an overview of what all different events exist there. So once you understand all that, you can create the components. You can assemble the components as we require. In this case, when we created a ready-made project using the Visual Studio template, which is offered by Visual Studio 2022, you can see that there is a static page component there. Then there are two other components like the fetch data and the counter component there, and also we can modularize much more as well as we go along. But basically these three components exist there, and these three components do its own individual area. Like the fetch data is capable of displaying the data there. It is also capable of it is also responsible for, that component is responsible for displaying some of the data inside that component, fetching the data, and how to display the data. All the associated events and all that is taken care of that component itself. So this way, more modular way of development is happening there. But as we used the Blazor server, the way by which it communicates with the server is through SignalR. So SignalR is a good mechanism which they chosen because it by default it uses the WebSockets, which is available in almost all modern web browsers, modern HTML5 browsers. But what about the legacy browsers? So automatically the SignalR will fall back to legacy mode. So that is the reason why this Blazor server way of developing project is suitable for developing internal application. Because inside an internal application, definitely we can ensure that if it is running inside an organization, there will be definitely a reliable connection for sure. It's not just for internal application inside an organization, if you are confident that there exists a reliable connection, and if you are confident that okay, the user uses the web page only inside a browser, like some kind of application, then definitely Blazor server is an easy to use approach, because you can easily migrate your application using the Blazor server model. Some of the things like authorization, authentication and all will be handled easily. It can be handled easily with Blazor, and also the debugging experience is also much more good in Blazor server. So if you feel that okay, there exists a good connection, then Blazor server is the one approach which you can follow on. But there are few limitations also as well. So one limitation is like the page creation is always happening on the server. I am talking about the Blazor server model. So in the Blazor server model of project creation, the page creation is actually happening on the server, and that requires the client should be always connected to the server. So if there is a break between the internet connection or something, and if the user clicks on the front end, so there won't be any response, and no proper updates will be happen, because a round trip is usually happening between the client and the server using the signaler. So that is one thing. Then another thing is, if users are evolving that much, maybe today 10 users, and at a later point of time suddenly thousands of users joined, then scalability is also a problem. But the Azure offers some of the components like the signaler hub, which can be used to increase the scalability. Also, because the page creation and everything is happening on the server side, so it requires you to host inside an ASP.NET Core server. So then the main advantage is like the easy development, good debugging experience, and also only if small footprint is required for browsers to run the application, because everything is generated in the server side. Older browser versions are also supported. We will look into the other hosting model called the Blazor WebAssembly, but Blazor WebAssembly requires the support of the browser called the WebAssembly, which is by default there in all the modern browsers, so that won't be a problem. But limitation is with the Blazor WebAssembly is WebAssembly that we will be going to discuss soon, is that the Blazor WebAssembly type of project creation doesn't support the older versions. Only the modern browsers are supported. It should require support of the WebAssembly. But if you feel that you want to support the older versions and there is a reliable connection exists between your client and the server, a stable internet connection, then stable in the sense like non-breaking. It doesn't require a massive bandwidth kind of connection. A reliable connection is what it meant. So if you have such a connection, then the Blazor server model of approach is good. And also, like you understand, the majority of the code is generation on all is happening in the server side, and all the code exists in the server. So that means if you want to connect to some server side services or database, it is very easily possible with the help of very easy to code that with the help of the Blazor server. So that is one approach. The template that is created by Visual Studio has enough for you to get started, but you need to learn some of the things like how to create a component using the Razor syntax, how to wire it up, how to create a different pages and all. Those all things you need to understand, which is available from Microsoft documentation. But just by running that Blazor server project which is created from the Visual Studio, you can learn, you usually get a good grasp about how it is working and all. And also we understand the mechanism behind how it is working. Then rest of things you can add on the layer top of that. Next we will discuss on the other hosting model that is offered by Blazor, which is the Blazor WebAssembly. Majority of the blog post and everything that is nowadays connected with the Blazor that is available in website in internet talks extensively on Blazor WebAssembly. I remember I talked with one of my friend a few years back when Blazor was in initial stage, and at that time when I mentioned about Blazor, my friend, so his name is John, and he suddenly mentioned, okay, it's very interesting, and because of the fact why he got interested is it has the support of WebAssembly, which has a rich scope for evolution, and he was very interested in that because of the use of the WebAssembly. So WebAssembly, it's we can think about, you can learn more about that in the Wikipedia. So this Blazor WebAssembly model uses the WebAssembly. So WebAssembly can be think of as a kind of an instruction format, kind of a binary instruction format, which is actually compiled, and it has a smaller footprint, and it is designed for the native speed, which is closer to C++. So it is much more performant than JavaScript itself. So if you think about the normal JavaScript way of development, usually you add JavaScripts, and when a user loads that page in browser, the JavaScript is loaded, it is parsed, then it is optimized, and then it is compiled, JIT compiled, and then it is rendered, and the browser updates that. So all these things are not required in the case of WebAssembly because it's in a binary format and a binary instruction format. So it has more performance. The only disadvantage here is so this WebAssembly and its associated instruction has a, even though it has a small footprint, still it needs to be downloaded from the server to the client side when a loading of a page happens. So that is the reason why if you create a Blazor WebAssembly based project using Visual Studio, you can see that the project has a bit higher footprint than that of the Blazor server assembly. In this Blazor server assembly, everything is happening on the server, and just the required rendered portion is what transferred to the client side via the signaler. But in the case of the WebAssembly, initially at the loading of the web page, there is a file called I don't exactly remember if it's called something like something dot it's yeah, it's actually something like Blazor dot WebAssembly dot something dot JS or something. So that file is actually downloading. So that file contains all the different WebAssembly instructions. That is, it includes the runtime called the .NET.wasp, and then it has also the different components which you created that is required for rendering that web page, and also the Blazor and the render tree and everything that is compiled into that particular JavaScript, and it is sending to the that WebAssembly is what it is sent to the client side. And then the Blazor uses a combination of the JS interop to update the required portion. So the difference here is like rather than the page is constructed and the required portion is updated via signaler, here the Blazor use a different combination in the case of Blazor WebAssembly mode of hosting. Here Blazor uses a kind of a WebAssembly, then the JS interop and other model to actually identify the DOM generation, and then using the JS interop it actually updates the data here. So it's kind of a much more client side updation is actually happening in the DOM rather than the server generating and sending back and update it. It's the client side WebAssembly is responsible for updating all these things, and the JS interop is responsible for updating this with the help of the WebAssembly. And also the in this model it has a kind of a secure model and has a strict sandbox model as well. So here in this Blazor WebAssembly model, the Blazor uses a combination of WebAssembly and the JavaScript interop to make the updates that is happening on the client. Keep in mind that a DOM tree will still be generated in the server, but the main updation is happening on the client side with the help of the WebAssembly and the JS interop. The major concern with this kind of approach or the WebAssembly approach that always this Blazor had a limitation which many developers usually feel, especially the JavaScript likers who always comment out many times like, okay, Blazor is there, but still still the footprint is very high. So that is the disadvantage they are feeling. But we have to keep one thing in mind, like if you look at a normal React based or Angular based or purely vanilla JavaScript based web application, still there would be a lot of JavaScripts that is loading when a page is loaded. And then if you think about that, the size is very, very much high, and in addition to that the JavaScript needs to be parsed, then it needs to be interpreted and then compiled and all. So all these things are not required in the case of WebAssembly. Even though there is a slightly higher footprint in the case of WebAssembly, still there is no interpretation or compilation or anything is happening there. So definitely the going forward, Blazor has a much higher possibility over JavaScript, I feel. But still, we can't say that it entirely eradicates the JavaScript ecosystem, because there is a huge fan surrounding JavaScript, and some of them are against the Microsoft C# or they prefer some other neutral vendor kind of language to deal with. So definitely JavaScript has a massive ecosystem, and many organizations like Facebook and Google are investing heavily in JavaScript based components, JavaScript based frameworks and libraries like React and Angular and many others as well. So definitely JavaScript will be there, but the possibility that Blazor offers is for the C# developers, they can, I think around 90% they can eradicate not eradicate, sorry, they can entirely reduce the dependency on JavaScript at all. But still some cases they need the dependency of JavaScript, like especially when on cases like if you want to identify some of the device related changes or something, then definitely that time Blazor needs the support of JavaScript. So that is happening via JavaScript interop. So if you look on the Microsoft documentation, you can see that JavaScript interop can be used to communicate with a normal JavaScript from the Blazor, and the reverse also you can do. Both are available in the documentation, so that way you can do. But the main point here is majority of things you can develop using the Blazor itself, using the C# itself, without depending too much on the JavaScript. Because becoming an expert in two different languages is very difficult. It can be done. Many experts are already there, proficient in different languages, and there is only a slightly learning curve there. But still, if a developer, or from an organization perspective, if they have a set of .NET developers who are focusing entirely on C#, then they can utilize all that knowledge and purely for developing a web application rather than switching back and here forth. Then another good thing that I noticed with the Blazor is, especially when using the Blazor server, is the debugging experience it offers. Out of the two different hosting models we discussed, the Blazor server has a good debugging experience. We can accurately pinpoint where a problem exists, and then we can identify. But when it comes to Blazor WebAssembly, just like the case of React and the other frameworks, it's very difficult to pinpoint what component has caused that error, and we need to have an understanding about how all these components works and all. It's a slightly difficult. We can still use the Chrome debugging tool and React supporting debugging tools to find out those things, but still it's not easy as that of using a Blazor server project for sure, because you need to understand how the page is assembled and all and everything. But in the case of Blazor server, Visual Studio itself shows where that problem happens. But in the case of the other things, you need to debug and identify, okay, where that issue happened and all. So these are the some of the issues that I felt when developing with the normal JavaScript. And another thing is like JavaScript comes to a bit messy when as the project increases. So when we have a lot of components, it will be difficult to identify, okay, where that components exist, and then all these these are the problems of JavaScript when using JavaScript for developing large enterprise level applications. So this is the reason why when creating TypeScript, Microsoft mentioned that okay, JavaScript is okay for smaller application, but when it comes to large scale applications and with a large code base, JavaScript becomes a bit messy and difficult to maintain. This is one reason why TypeScript evolved, and because it helped to maintaining a large JavaScript, large code base, large JavaScript code base, then naturally the frameworks like Angular and libraries like React adopted that TypeScript into their ecosystem, and thus nowadays React and Angular is already have inbuilt support for TypeScript. So if we use TypeScript up to a level, we can reduce the complexity of maintaining JavaScript. But still, from those from a .NET background, and if they use the C# for developing applications, then definitely that would be a bigger advantage of them, and that future is what Microsoft is seeing when developing or heavily investing in frameworks like Blazor. So with the help of that, any .NET developer can without depending on JavaScript can develop single page at client-side applications just like they do with React and Angular. So when we learn React, the main part of learning React is understanding the components, how we can develop a component, how we can create a component with all its necessary functionality like its logic, its data assembling, and also the presentation and all encompassing into a single component, and how we can use that different modular components to create a page. That is what the majority of React learning curve is all about. So that same applies here in the case of Blazor as well. With the help of Visual Studio, we can create a sample application with the two of the popular hosting models that we discussed. One is the Blazor server model, where everything is rendered in the server, and another one is the WebAssembly model, where everything is happening mostly on the client side, exactly like the JavaScript. So we have learned that much, but to develop further, we need to understand how we can create a component using the Razor and all in Blazor. So that all details are available in the documentation. We will cover a quick detail of all the different possibilities that we can do with the help of components as we a bit later. Before that, as we were discussing about the WebAssembly, let's think about a bit more detail about some of the advantages and some of the limitations that WebAssembly has. One of the main limitation is like when initially loading the if you are creating a Blazor application using the WebAssembly hosting model, then it works exactly like a traditional JavaScript or a React application works, but the only problem here when compared with a React or other application is the level of footprint that it initially has. So initially when it loads a JavaScript, it has all the required components and all the different things compiled in a WebAssembly, and on the client side JavaScript Blazor client side Blazor uses a JS interrupt to update the things on the client side. So initial footprint of loading that page is a bit high. It's not that much high, because if you look or investigate some of the existing websites out there, most popular websites like Facebook or something, and if you look into the level of JavaScript they have, and if you consider all that, its size is very high. So compared to that, the Blazor footprint is much lower, because it's a kind of a compiled format. So it's compiled, and then it's as much smaller footprint than that of JavaScript. And also like as in JavaScript, there is no parsing or there is no compilation like the JIT is happening. Just in time compilation is happening in the case as in the case of JavaScript. So definitely this WebAssembly will be more performant, and also it will, even though it has a slighter higher footprint, that won't be a much problem. So that possibility is what Microsoft seeing when evolving a later version, evolving different versions of the Blazor. So if you by each version, the footprint is much reducing much further, we can hope. And also the other thing is like when we use the WebAssembly, we can use any API as we like. So if you have an existing application you want to port, and you feel that okay, we can go with the Blazor WebAssembly model of hosting, then the advantage you would get is like you can use any of the existing API model, whether your API can be generated developed using Python or Node.js or whatever. So you can all take leverage of that all advantage when you use the Blazor WebAssembly model. Second thing is like compared to the Blazor server, which requires a steady connection, this Blazor WebAssembly doesn't require that much steady connections, because it works like an offline way where majority of the things is happening on the browser side. So there is not that much steady connection is required. And also if you are planning to develop applications for slower connections or for mobile devices, and if you want to further evolve your application to a progressive web apps which works exactly like that of a mobile application, but it's also a web app. So that way if you want to plan, then definitely go for the Blazor WebAssembly model, because using the WebAssembly model you can evolve your application into a progressive web apps as well. Then there is no full round trip is required, and also you can have the possibility to further extend. So that is the reason why WebAssembly model of development is much popular. But keep in mind that if you want to migrate some of your existing application, and if you have not a problem with the internet connection or anything, and if it's mostly an internal application, or not only for internal application, even for client side application, if they are happy with that, then Blazor server way of hosting is the easiest model which you can follow, because in the Blazor server you can connect with the services and database from the server side itself. But if you are going for a WebAssembly model of hosting, then just like as you do in React and Angular, you need to develop the component, then you need to use an API, or you need to create an API behind the scene, and then you need to think about all the different authorization and authentication mechanism that is happening between the client side component and the server side component, and you need to think about all that, which is not required for the web server Blazor server model of deployment. So Blazor server model of deployment is the easiest one, and also for debugging experience, if you think about from a debugging perspective as well, that offers more easy form of debugging. You can accurately pinpoint where an issue happened in using the Blazor server model of hosting, while if you go for a Blazor WebAssembly model, it will be slightly difficult. It is still possible, but it will be slightly difficult. And those of you who developed the React applications, there also you can feel this difficulty. Like if you want to identify where an issue happens, even though there are a lot of debugging tools and all available, still you need to invest a bit to understand how things work behind the scene, how the component is functioning and all. So it's a bit challenging for a newcomer to understand an existing application, and especially to debug in the case of React or Angular. A bit challenging if it's not properly developed. But considering all that, if an organization has an way to go with a set of .NET developers and with a kind of a model like Blazor server model with a reliable internet connection, then that would be the easiest way of development, because they can use their existing knowledge to develop applications without depending anything at all about the JavaScript. There will be some dependency, like for example, if the client side Blazor wants to interact with some device related functionality like a Bluetooth or screen size or something, then definitely Blazor needs a way to communicate that is happening through JS interop. You can check out the documentation to learn how a Blazor component can communicate with an existing JavaScript. So that is also possible. That is happening through the JS, the Blazor, the Java, that is happening through the JavaScript interop. And the reverse is also can also happen from the .NET side. You can contact the JavaScript as well. So both ways are possible, but the main thing you need to aware while developing a Blazor web application is you will be writing majority of your code in C# and not in JavaScript, because that is why we chosen the Blazor for. Then all the things that we discussed up to now are explained from an example by using the Visual Studio, but you can use the same from a command line as well. So you can use, if you prefer the Visual Studio Code or some other editor, still you can use the Blazor. So the command line syntax, I can explain how the command line syntax looks like. You can refer the same from the documentation as well. Just search for creating a Blazor project using command line. that, or Visual Studio Code will give you enough details about how to create that. So the syntax looks like this. In small letter, .NET followed by a space followed by new. New indicates new project. We are going to create a new project. Then space, then Blazor server. So that is the template which we want to create. So if you want to create a Blazor WebAssembly, then you may need to provide a Blazor WebAssembly. Then space -i, and then followed by the project name you want. So if you want a project like my Blazor app or something, you can create that. So once you create that, just like you created in Visual Studio, it will create all the required things, and then what you can do is you can run the project by executing the command .NET space run. So this is the way by which we can create a Blazor server project or Blazor WebAssembly project using the command line or from the Visual Studio Code. Now we have understood what is Blazor, how it evolved, and how what are the different hosting models that are currently supported. Keep in mind that Blazor is evolving. There are much more coming. There are different projects ongoing. So probably there will be much updates that will be happening in the future. So if you are listening this at a later point of time, please keep or please refer the documentation for what all different versions you can have. But the basic concept will say that all you learned through this episode will remain the same, irrespective of that. And also, if you have interested in understanding how the Blazor server and Blazor WebAssembly client side works, what all JavaScripts are downloaded, how it is pulling all these things, then you can refer the documentation which is available from MSDN as well. That part is not required for you to create an application, but if you are curious to understand that, you can refer that as well. Basically, in Blazor server it uses SignalR, and in the Blazor WebAssembly it uses a combination of Blazor WebAssembly with the JS interop. So with that understanding and with a ready-made project that is offered by the Visual Studio, we get a understanding about an overall understanding about how the Blazor works. But to get more understanding about to develop application, you need to understand how to create Blazor components. And that part we are not covering in this episode, but you can refer the documentation and you can learn that. I will just quickly go through an overview of how we can create a component, and then what all different ways we can create a component. So there are 3 ways to create a component. One is using a pure eraser syntax with the code and the HTML sharing the same file. So that is one approach. Then another one is a code behind file together with the eraser file. So the eraser file is actually the component. So if you have a web page, it has different functionalities. So maybe a page has different, we can break your page into different components, just like as you do with React. So breaking a page into ideal components is the one thing which you need to learn when developing the SPA frameworks, using whether it be Blazor or React or Angular. You need to learn how to split your page into modular components. The more further you can break a component, the better control you can have over a component, and the better maintainable your code will be. So sometimes we create a component and then we identify, okay, we can further break down. But if you have the ability to predict how you can split up a component, that will be definitely helpful when creating this SPA kind of architectures like React or Angular or even Blazor. Those all apply same. So even though Blazor uses C# and not using JavaScript at all, but still the component idea remains the same. So the distinct feature of functionality is wrapped as a component, and you are assembling that components into a page. So that is applicable here as well. So you can create different ways to create a component, but basic thing is you can create a Razor component page, and then these just like the earlier versions of React, like the class-based React, have different lifecycle events associated with it. Similar way, the React, similar ways, the Blazor component also has its associated lifecycle events. So some of the common events that are available with the Blazor components is on initialized, on parameter set, on after render, or should render, etc. So those of you who are not familiar with the idea of what a component and its associated lifecycle event, so just for your understanding telling, like if you look at the earlier versions of React or some of the documentations of React which is available from Facebook, you can see that some lifecycle methods they explain there, how your component should work based on that lifecycle events. You can customize that. So these lifecycle events are provided for you to customize how that component works. When that component loads, what it should perform. When it is unloaded, what it should perform. All those things. So we are creating a page with a different component. So we can customize how each component behaves. So using the lifecycle events, we can have a bit of control. But in the later versions of React, they've gone for a hook-based approach where they replaced the class-based component and they've gone more with the functional-based components, which is what nowadays majority of the React developers are using. But in the case of Blazor component, actually you will be creating components using the C# and the Razor markup language, which is a combination of HTML, CSS, and also some of the C# code, and then you will be assembling that same way as like the React. But here in the case of Blazor, you will be having some lifecycle events like the on initialized, on parameter set, and all. And also the data binding is another thing. So the data binding approach is similar like the Angular. You can have one-way binding as well as the two-way binding that is supported. But in the case of React, there is only one-way binding, and React DOM is responsible for re-rendering that component. But in the case of the Blazor, the data binding can be one-way binding or two-way binding. Both are supported. And in addition to that, a rich set of form validations and other things are also provided by the Blazor component. So inbuilt support for validations like the input text validation summary. Just like if you have worked with the earlier versions of ASP.NET, you might be familiar with all those things. So that same way, different inbuilt features that are specific to Blazor are available here that you can take advantage of. And also there is a concept called the reusable component. So just like when you create a component, you don't need to bother about whether I am creating the component for a Blazor server hosting model or whether I am creating a component for a Blazor WebAssembly model. You can have a component independent of these hosting models, and that offers the possibility to reuse these components. So you can move the common set of components into a shared library, and you can use that same for the Blazor server based project as well as for WebAssembly as well. So that offers a kind of a community contribution as well, whether if you want to share with some community members or even inside your organization different other projects, you can create reusable components and share it with others. Then related to the debugging part for developing the web application using the Blazor, the Blazor server offers the Blazor server hosting model offers the best debugging experience, but debugging support is also there for Blazor WebAssembly as well, but it's a slight different. You need to navigate to a different page and then back to the again to the same page to exactly pinpoint where that issue happened. So there is a slight difference there. You can check out the documentation to learn how to debug a Blazor application. Then the hosting of the Blazor application can be supported on any ASP.NET Core hosting supported host. So this Blazor can also be hosted on container. So when you create a application, web application using the Blazor, if you enable to run it inside a container, you can have the possibility for that as well. So containerizing application has its own possibilities where you can scale it up and down massively, and you can have a kind of a better control with its dependencies, and you can so that's a different kind of approaches where it's usually followed in microservice kind of architecture. So that way also you can deploy. Then if you are using a Blazor server model of hosting, make sure, and if you are deploying that to the cloud, make sure that the WebSockets are enabled by default, because just like we learned earlier, in the case of Blazor server, the mechanism used for communicating between the client and the server is actually SignalR, which by default uses the web socket. So if you disable, or if the cloud doesn't support it, or maybe in some cases it may be turned off, then it goes back, then the SignalR falls back to other mechanism. So web socket is good, so enabling that will be good if you are planning to deploy the web Blazor server on a different server or something. So these are all the things I want to present here in this episode. Hope this would help you to get started with Blazor. So Blazor is not a new thing, as like I explained earlier. A few years back, one of my friend John had talked with me about this Blazor, and later it evolved that much. So now we can see that Microsoft is investing heavily in Blazor, but we can't say like it can replace JavaScript at all, because there is a huge community and fan base surrounding JavaScript. They won't prefer to use C# at all. So definitely there will be arguments in favor of JavaScript, and many companies like React, Facebook and Google are already investing massively for their frameworks and libraries. So definitely it will be there, but for the .NET developers, this Blazor would be a different possibility, and maybe if it becomes a hit, like nowadays .NET Core is massively used across the different open source projects. So same way, if it becomes evolved, and then maybe a possibility for its rapid use across different organizations. Already, if you look at the documentation, I can see many of the clients are already started using Blazor. And when I looked some of the applications, it looks very interesting, and it works exactly like the kind of a native React application or some well-matured framework. So definitely there is a possibility, but it all depends. So we can't sure how Microsoft go across, because what I felt in the case of Microsoft model is at any time they can drop a particular technology, or just as in the case of Windows Phone, when they started supporting the Windows Phone, so they tried a lot, and I had a Windows Phone, and we had a thinking like, okay, it will be it will evolve, but after some point of time Microsoft stopped that. So hope that what happens for Blazor. hope it evolves. So that is all what we can hope. So thank you everyone for listening this podcast. I think it's more than 1 hour, and in between a break happened because somehow my recording got stopped in between, but I restarted from there, so might be a slight break happened in between. So try to if you are interested, try to hear my other podcast episodes as well, and also my YouTube channel Coding Talks with myself. So with that, thanks for listening this episode. Have a great weekend ahead. Thank you.